Zimbabwe's latest appalling chapter. It's a tragedy made even greater by the fact that this country once had one of Africa's better healthcare systems. No doubt many of you watching tonight would like to assist the people seen in our story, but what to do? Foreign aid has long been the world's way of responding to Africa's woes. But what if the aid is actually making things worse? Here's Europe correspondent Philip Williams with an interesting new take on a very old problem.
You've got to get on the phone and take the money out of your pocket. Don't go to the pub tonight, please. Stay in and give us the money. There are people dying now, so give me the money.
Appalled by the seeming indifference of the developed world, Bob Geldof and a group of celebrities got together to raise money for Africa.
The whole day down, 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 shoot it all down.
The result, of course, was the global broadcast phenomenon called Live Aid. The concerts raised millions of dollars from ordinary people around the world and marked the beginning of a new era of celebrity saviours who've been growing in authority, number and influence ever since. Enter African economist and author Dambisa Moyo, billed as the anti-Bono and with a provocative book called Dead Aid, a stinging critique of the so-called glamour aid. Moyo argues aid is not a solution, it's the problem.
I don't agree with the message. Fundamentally, I don't think Africa needs more aid. I think it needs less aid. It needs governments to be made accountable to the domestic citizenry and not accountable to donors. Africans stand in the hot African sun to elect their leaders. And it's those leaders who are charged with the responsibility of delivering social services and being accountable to their people. There clearly was a vacuum that has allowed the celebrity culture to seep in, but it would seem to me that no society would appreciate their whole policy and the future of their children to be dependent on celebrities that actually don't live in these contexts.
In 2005, Live Aid had become Live 8, and the frontrunners, the now Sir Bob Geldof and Bono, were taking their message directly to world leaders. But for Dambisa Moyo, the rise and rise of glamour aid is only part of the problem. She's also railing against what she describes as the self-perpetuating aid industry.
Basically, aid has become an industry. There are just way too many vested interests, and by and large, the criticisms that my book has been receiving are coming from those quarters, people who actually have a vested interest to see the continuous cycle of Africa in despair so that they can justify their existence.
What sort of people are you talking about?
I'm talking about academics, I'm talking about people from the NGO community, I'm talking about people who are policymakers and politicians who know that it doesn't work. The evidence has shown it doesn't work. In 1970, 10% of Africans lived in poverty. It's now more like 70%. In many countries, as high as 85% of Africans are living in poverty at a time when the aid model has become so dominant.
What's the solution?
In the book, I actually prescribe that they should, with immediate effect, or in the very near foreseeable future, implement a 5-year plan where they systematically reduce aid to these countries. I would say that things like the capital markets are an easy way for countries to start to fund themselves. So, in the worst case scenario, governments in Africa should focus on getting ratings. They should be focusing on learning how to pitch to international investors so that when the markets do come back, which they invariably will, they'll be ready to raise money in the capital markets. But on the other hand, right now there are non-traditional markets such as China and the Middle East where money does exist, and African governments should be talking to these places about issuing bonds and raising capital that way.
As we've just seen in Zimbabwe, there is a desperate need for humanitarian aid. In response to the new power-sharing deal there, Australia's just committed $10 million to fight cholera and encourage medical professionals to come back and help. Beyond the humanitarian question, though, Dambisa Moyo claims the enduring problem is the scale of government-to-government aid, the large systemic cash transfers from rich countries to Africa. Huge amounts of money squandered by the likes of Mugabe.
In the book, I talk about the fact that the Zimbabwean government received from the United Kingdom and the United States, around $300 million as late as 2006. I think that's worrying. I think that's a big concern. The fact that Mugabe can and does come to Europe and the United States. I was just in New York last September, and he was attending the UN meetings. And the fact that the UK and the United States maintain diplomatic ties with Zimbabwe leaves the African on the ground, wondering what options they have to bring their governments to accountability.
I suspect many people watching this program would say the problem's not aid, it's corrupt leaders.
Right. I don't think you can delink the two in the African context. I think an aid model makes good leaders bad and makes bad leaders worse. It's free money. There are no strings attached. Even in the times when multilateral institutions and donors have talked about conditionalities, those conditionalities are weak. They are not applied, again, because the aid industry, it thrives and it feeds on Africans borrowing money, and so the cycle keeps going on.
Does it make you angry when you look at the amount of money that's been spent in Africa over the past 20, 30 years?
Well, I think it's absurd. In 1 year of a problem in the capitalist system, and we are so critical of capitalism, 60 years of an aid-dependent model, and we hear only calls for more aid. That, to me, is intellectual dishonesty, particularly from the quarters of people who I know for a fact have been big proponents of capitalism in other regions of the world. But when it comes to Africa, they're big supporters of aid. I think
why?
That,
what, is there a blind spot there? Or why particularly Africa?
To be quite honest, I think it's built in pity. I think the whole aid model emanates from a pity for Africa, a sense that Africa cannot do it, cannot achieve growth. And sadly, because there are incentives, which, as you know, the world has shown, people, governments, companies respond to incentives. There are incentives for African governments to take aid. We've basically ended up in a situation where it doesn't work, and we're happy to just keep it going.
And you're absolutely confident that removing that aid is not going to leave at least some people without food, without medicine?
I think the ones that will be affected most will probably be the African elite, as opposed to the broader population. What
will they lose?
I think they would lose possibly their bank accounts in Geneva in the worst case scenario. But I think beyond that, I think that they would also lose the ability to have leisure time, and they'd be required to actually go out and start to work hard to find money to support their social programs in Africa.
What would you say, though, to the well-meaning Australian who donates to the charity, who urges the Australian government, for example, to lift its game with aid and go? What would you say to those people?
I would say it's very important to understand what that type of aid can and cannot do. It can provide a band-aid solution. So we've talked about humanitarian aid as one example of that, but it cannot deliver long-term growth that would ensure Africa to stand on its own 2 feet and become an equal partner on the global stage. So to give you an example, yes, you might help fund a scholarship for a girl to go to school, but when she's done with her education, the fact that aid is so pernicious and so damaging to an economy means that the economy has not grown, that girl that you've helped sponsor will not find a job in her economy.
If you cut off aid within 5 years, surely that's going to leave millions of people without the support they are now dependent on. Food aid, medical aid, aid that really keeps people alive.
I don't believe that's the case. Most Africans do not see any of the aid that you are alluding to. It's, again, their best case scenario in some projects is 20 cents on the dollar that actually makes it to an African. And that's best case. Effectively, if we continue down this path, we will have many more Africans living in poverty in few years to come, and that is really the problem, that there are no jobs coming out of an aid model.
And with the market reforms that you would advocate in that system, under that system, if it's widely adopted, what vision do you have of Africa?
The vision I have is basically one that looks like what's happened in the rest of the world when they've adopted those models. Growth rates that could get up to double digits, as we've seen in China and India and so on, and also much more participation by the broader African society, not only in terms of economic participation and entrepreneurship, but also in terms of political participation and ensuring that their governments are held accountable to deliver those services.
Let's hope you're right. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much. And I am right.
Dambisa Moyo's book is called Dead Aid. And wouldn't it be interesting to be a fly on the wall when she finally gets in the same room as Bob Geldof and Bono?